real and unconscionable. It didn't come to that, but the Thursday briefings morphed into a popular and useful group with changing membership, which fosters networking and information sharing. It will surely continue when the pandemic is past. Outside of COVID, we have continued our work with our sister movement, Reform Judaism. We have a joint working party through which we work with Leah College over the training of our rabbis. We already work with RJ in areas of student chaplaincy and education, and we look to collaborate in other areas as opportunities present. This year's conference has the theme of inclusion, breaking down walls. Inclusion inevitably follows from collaboration. We talk and work with people, find new areas of common ground, barriers between us evaporate, and all are included. It involves learning from each other and sometimes acknowledging preconceptions or where we've got it wrong. LJ has long been a proud leader, perhaps trailblazer in inclusion. We introduced non-gender language early and included women and people who are LGBTQ+ before many. The introduction of same-sex marriages was a moment of true pride and made a significant difference to those who felt included as a consequence. It is the case that, after any of these changes, as we look back, we find that the barrier or wall that we had perceived has disappeared, leaving us wondering what exactly all the fuss had been about. I have come to realise that issues can look very different from different sides of the very same wall. On the inside, we may not even be able to see the problem, but from the outside, we find it quite hurtful. During the past year, the Council of Liberal Rabbis and Cantors agreed a report by Rabbi Danny Rich to have marriage blessings under the chuppah for the Jewish homes that were to be created by couples comprising a Jew and a non-Jew who were getting married. It is something that affects me personally, in which my husband Andrew and I will be discussing with Rabbi Eryn London tomorrow afternoon at 5 o'clock. Everything has a time, and this change means a great deal to us both. We will be more than pleased to hear your thoughts and to answer any questions that you have. Some aspects of inclusion are not controversial. LJ has been very fortunate to enjoy the services of Owen Power, who is a true powerhouse and is on the board of national officers with the Portfolio for Inclusion. He is also co-chair of this conference. Owen taught his fellow board members to speak clearly on Zoom with their mouths uncovered, in good lighting, and to speak one at a time. Not only is that essential for people who don't hear, but it's also much better for everyone. We can understand more easily, and somehow it creates a calmer and more productive operating environment. Building on this foundation, we ensured all discussions at the Board of National Officers and at Council, along with any disagreements that may ensue, take place within an atmosphere of mutual respect. Thus, quieter people are comfortable to share their views. We have made further changes in governance in the interest of inclusion. All items on agendas are accompanied by a written report that is circulated a week or two before the relevant meeting. Thus, all have the opportunity to read the reports, formulate their views and any questions, and make informed and effective contributions. In the interest of open and transparent governance, all decisions that BOLO make are now shared with Council. One such decision is that events and meetings that have a national focus, and that would include those of BOLO and Council, will continue to be online so that our entire membership can be included. We have made progress on inclusion, but our work is not done. The Board of Deputies started an investigation on the situation of Black Jews and Jews of colour last year, and you can hear the author of this report, Stephen Bush, talk about it and answer questions on Sunday afternoon. At about the same time, I attended an event put on by the Israeli Embassy to celebrate Sigt. Well, That's an Ethiopian festival about accepting the Torah and yearning for Jerusalem and the temple. I realized how embarrassingly little I knew about Ethiopian Jewish culture and history. The Shoah is not part of the history of the Jews of Ethiopia, Iraq, or India, to name but a few. They have different stories which need to be heard, and different festivals and cultures which should be celebrated. Liberal Judaism will be all the richer for it. I have learned how, in our own community, that we do not have enough representation in positions of responsibility, and even in the imagery we use and the stories we tell of Jews of colour and Black Jews, including those from Sephardi and Mizrahi backgrounds. These Jews have felt marginalised. We need to get our own house in order, and to that end, Council created a committee for Black Jews and Jews of colour in Liberal Judaism to bring recommendations and learning to us. That work is still ongoing, and I expect there may be further walls to break down that I haven't seen yet, because I may be on the wrong side of them. But I'm always here to learn and to hear from you. I have just a couple more things to say before I hand over to Rabbi Leah. As the conference is online, we can't meet in the corridor. So I will be in a chat room this evening at 7 o'clock. I will be very pleased to meet you, to catch up, to hear your thoughts, answer any questions you have about what I've just said, or about the future of LJ or anything else, or just to make your acquaintance and hear your Jewish story. It would be very nice to see you. This conference is being provided free of charge, but it hasn't been free to provide, and we would appreciate any donations. We have calculated if those attending the weekend donated £50, then our cost would be covered. That's for information. Please just give what's comfortable for you. There is a donation button on our website, and we'll really be grateful for anything. This year's conference has been created and led by co-chairs Rabbi Leah Jordan and by Owen Power, an LJ trustee who I mentioned earlier, supported by LJ Fundraising and Events Manager Tom Rich. I now hand over to Rabbi Leah. Thank you and enjoy your weekend.
Thank you so much, Ruth and Charlie. Welcome everyone to Biennial. Hi, I'm Rabbi Leah Jordan, the rabbinic co-chair of Biennial 2021, Breaking Down Walls. Outside of Biennial weekend, I wear other hats as community rabbi of Kehillah North London and Stoke Newington, and a founding member of NAMOD, British Jews Against Occupation, and co-founder of Azara, a cross-communal British pluralist Torah learning initiative just launched. I am so excited to be here. Thank you especially to Rabbi Charlie Baginski for asking me many months ago, do you want to co-program a wonderful weekend for Liberal Judaism? And thank you for all of your work and support for Biennial, Charlie. I've genuinely had a great time. And thank you to Ruth and the Board of National Officers and all of LJ for their support on the way here. I just wanted to take this opportunity at the start to tell you a little about this year's Biennial, what the program has to offer, and then thank some of the other folks who made it possible. In response to the challenges of this year, as both Ruth and Charlie have mentioned, Liberal Judaism's Biennial Weekend 2021, I hope you will find, is something special and unique. At last year's Biennial, we moved online in the heart of the first lockdown, and we learned we really could do an all-digital conference and do it well. And we learned, too, that it has its advantages. Now, with more time to plan toward those strengths, we are doubling down, we hope, on the silver linings. As co-chair, I'm biased, but we have strived to make Biennial 2021 more accessible, inclusive, and interesting than ever. And as our theme, Knocking Down Walls, Building a Judaism for Everyone, what that means is we are really showcasing how our movement creates space for the most diverse and interesting sort of Jewish community, built on the values of progressivism and inclusion that have been at the heart of Liberal Judaism since its founding almost 120 years ago. In true Jewish fashion, we will also hold ourselves to account to do better, to continue to push that horizon and build sustainable change within our Jewish spaces for the 21st century. So I have to thank this year's biennial committee team for all working so hard to create a biennial weekend that really reflects this diverse, inclusive, forward-thinking liberal identity in as many ways as possible. Owen Power is my inestimable co-chair in that endeavor. Owen self-identifies as a deaf, queer, liberal Jew and a campaigner against anti-Semitism, homophobia, and any kind of hate. He is especially passionate about challenging the exclusion of deaf people from participating in their communities due to thoughtlessness and prejudice. And he brings that critical lens to every bit of work he does more broadly within our liberal Jewish communities, and definitely for this weekend at Biennial. I also want to thank on team Tanya Garfield and Simon Rothstein from Liberal Judaism for all the comms and PR. Thank you. And thank you to Omar Portillo, who was on Biennial team for most of this past year, wearing his hat as chair of the Action Group on Black Jews and Jews of Color Inclusivity in the liberal Jewish community. The Jewish community is a rich, multi-ethnic, international community, Omar reminded us. Our Jewish scriptures, he says, teach us that we came out of Egypt in our mixed multitudes and as a diverse nation. All Jews stood together at Sinai in all of our diversity. The committee also includes liberal Jewish youth leaders in their early 20s, like LJY's Jess Mendel, rabbis and chairs and lay leaders from many of our communities, including Rabbi Igor Zinkoff, who has coordinated the heck out of all of our prayer services over this weekend, and lay leaders like Leo Mendel, who is teching the heck out of this whole weekend with his tech team. Thank you all. Community chairs like Tamara Joseph, Finchley Progressive, who has pushed us to put on the best programming we can, and who even herself crowd fundraised for some of that programming, along with many of our communities and shuls who gave. And certainly not to be forgotten, Tom Rich, who is event manager for Liberal Judaism and who earns his way in work with all he does for Biennial this year and every year. Because we will be an all digital thing, we will also be able to showcase our communities by literally zooming to them throughout this weekend, especially in prayer services and outside of it, hearing from people right across the UK and Europe, and even in the United States and Israel, to see them in their environment as speakers on conference, whilst participating from the comfort of our own homes. So lastly, here are some highlights of the program. An opening keynote in a few hours from Rabbi René Lappi, the Rosh Yeshiva and founder of Sfara, the traditionally radical yeshiva in the United States, whose aim and message is that disruptive innovation and rigorous learning are baked into the Jewish DNA. An anti-racism workshop piloted specifically for Jewish communities from Charlotte Fisher of Jewish Justice Center and Shea Akiwowo of Glitch, and Tuli, an Israeli speaker, and Osama, a Palestinian speaker, speaking to us tomorrow afternoon about their justice work with Combatants for Peace to end the occupation in Israel-Palestine. And a cross-faith panel on faith in a post-COVID world, a cross-communal Jewish panel from Haredi to progressive of Jewish women leadership on the future of inclusion in British Jewish life, a panel on non-institutional public Jewish life with speakers, for example, ranging from the co-founder of the Pink Peacock Cafe, a queer anarchist Yiddish cafe in Glasgow, Scotland, and lots of sessions and speakers highlighting the best of liberal Judaism, our work in university chaplaincy and liberal Jewish youth, other liberal leaders, rabbis, and thinkers on the theology of inclusion, and so much more. And interspersed with this main track of conference are lighter, more fun, or more interesting side options, including transitional content between sessions, like Progressively Jewish Podcast, Jew Know What, and Lily's Legacy Podcast, as well as lunch and learns throughout from many of our community rabbis, and a whole track run by LJY Netzer, a pub quiz tomorrow, Saturday night, and places hopefully to interact and socialize and meet one another online in various spaces. Finally, communities have also learned a song together and have videoed themselves singing it, and will join in singing it together here at Biennial over the weekend. And communities have also made pitches to Liberal Judaism for Liberal Judaism funding toward an inclusion project for their home communities. And we will hear some of the finalist pitches. They will make up one of the concluding panels on Sunday in a Jewish Inclusion Project Dragon's Den style panel. So this year, we hope we have gone some way toward putting on a biennial weekend that uplifts the true diversity of Jewish voices and to put on a truly content-rich and thought-provoking weekend. Biennial 2021 Knocking Down Walls aims to celebrate, as our co-chair Owen always puts it, inclusion in action. Thank you and enjoy.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am so delighted to be here to welcome you to our first session of the Liberal Judaism Biennial. We are going to open our space this afternoon, say hi to some wonderful leaders who'll be joining us in conversation to kick off thoughts, challenge, and some motivating moments that will take us through the next couple of days. I will start now by saying Shabbat Shalom. I hope that for some of you who are watching, maybe you're getting ready for Shabbat, you're getting ready to enter this space of our biennial and to think about conversations that will spark not just the space that you inhabit in your community, but our wider community. I'll be encouraging you to think about how we create space, how we don't just come to conclusions. Let's not go straight to how do we solve the problem, but let's sit with the conversation. Let's sit with how we start to solve, that this time allows us to springboard and open our thinking over the next couple of days. I will be welcoming into the space Shaan, who is the Heritage Project Manager at Liberal Judaism, Rabbi Leah, who is the Rabbi of Keilah, North London, Rabbi Alex, who is the Senior Rabbi of the Liberal Jewish Synagogue, and Rabbi René, who is the Rabbi of KLS and visiting Rabbi to Wessex Liberal Synagogue, and the co-chair of KOLRAC, which is the Liberal Judaism Rabbinic Assembly. So I can see you popping up on my screen. It's lovely to see you, Rabbi Alex, Rabbi René, Shaan, and I think we also have Rabbi Leah, who's probably running from room to room, even though it's virtual room this afternoon. It's lovely to see you all. Thank you. Also, thank you for preparing. I know I've given you a heads up a little bit on the questions. Thank you for your time, for your perspective, for your wisdom this afternoon. For those of you watching and participating, I invite you in the comments to share your reflections as we go along. And I will reflect those back to our panelists, ask them some questions in between. We'll have two sets of questions. And the first one I'm going to ask is, what is the one thing that is top of your priority list that you really think will make a difference in our ability, our collective ability to create of this big question, one Jewish space out of many Jewish identities, voices, and perspectives? So it's a big question. If we could solve it in the next 45 minutes, that would be great. No, we're not going straight to solutions. But Rabbi Alex, I'm going to be asking you first, just to reflect on that question. We'll have a few minutes from you, and then we'll move to Rabbi René. So Rabbi Alex.
Well, thank you, Michelle. It's a great honor to be on this panel. I think to begin with, I'd want to question that phrase, one Jewish space. Why one? Why not multiple Jewish spaces? Wouldn't this rather create a richness of experience, greater fluidity in terms of spaces that we might explore, allowing ourselves to move between them religiously, philosophically, socially? But as you've asked the question, let me try and answer it. One way might be sociologically. How do we look at ways in which our Jewish community here in the UK is structured? How does it function? How do we see it developing? What does it mean to be a community of different ethnicities, denominations, genders? How do our family backgrounds, our education, culture, and work determine what we might bring into the Jewish spaces or space we occupy. To explore that question sociologically may well be a useful place to start, because it would help us to understand more acutely the issues of social differentiation and power. One of the ways I think synagogues work well, both socially, educationally, religiously, is that difference is flattened by being part of a community working towards a certain vision and goal. You could also answer the question politically, not in terms of party politics, but in the sense, again, of power. When you have different identities, voices, perspectives, agendas, how does a single Jewish space represent all the differences that want to be part of it? If you take the subject of Israel, for example, how can a community or movement create one space for those with differing views about Israel's politics to be part of it? The danger, it seems to me, of creating one space is it increases the bent towards populism and authoritarianism. And that's something we must resist at all costs in our movement and in our communities. But the way I'd want to begin to answer this question is theologically. I'd want to ask, is there a paradigm, is there a model that holds the idea of oneness while comprehending a multiplicity of voices, attributes, identities, and perspectives? And the answer is yes. The theological model which applies well to this question can be derived from the anonymous prophet of the 6th century, Deutero-Isaiah. This prophet uses a multiplicity of poetic, personal, highly anthropomorphic images when speaking about God. He speaks about a God who's both transcendent and immanent, a God of strong contrasting human emotions, anger and zeal, delight and love, pity, compassion, mercy. This God is also a hive of activity, speaks and leads, works, feeds, carries, allays fears, offers comfort. This is a God who goes out as a mighty man, who stirs up jealousy like a man of war. He cries aloud and cries out and shouts aloud. This God gasps and pants like a woman in labor. This God is a shepherd, king, warrior, huntsman, husband, father, potter, everything, redeemer. And the answer to your question, Michelle, has to be theological. If we create a theological paradigm based on the prophet's idea of the oneness of God, but with multiple attributes, our communities, our movement could be embedded more firmly in the idea of a single space, although I would want to be very careful about becoming too essentialist in answering this question.
Rabbi Alex, thank you so much. And the theology, the thoughts that you've evoked in many of us, I'm sure, as we've listened to you, will carry us through this conversation. I realize in understanding what it means to make a space, I neglected to introduce myself. So here I am introducing myself, a proud member of a liberal Jewish community and the co-CEO of the Jewish Leadership Council. I'm going to give a shout out to SBJC, South Bucks Jewish Community, my fabulous community that I am a member of. Rabbi Alex, you have given us thought around spaces, around what it means to hold it. The flattening was really interesting for me. And hopefully, Rabbi René, you can carry us through with your thoughts and reflections. And if you would like to, if you're listening, watching, and like to reflect your thoughts and comments, please put them in the chat. Rabbi René.
Yeah, good afternoon. Thank you, Michelle. Thank you for having me today. And it's indeed a huge question. And it's great that we have an entire biennial dedicated to trying to understand what inclusion means. I would like to start with maybe something that is very much embedded in our human nature, which is there's always a certain level of resistance to change. We always struggle when we want to change something, we want to open the borders or break down walls. And I think it's probably something that we need as human beings, in order to soothe our ontological anxiety. We need to have some certainties in life. And it's been really, really highlighted by the recent COVID pandemic when we were so unsettled and so frightened. So I think it doesn't mean that we have to withdraw in our own world, but precisely when we feel like this, we have to push ourselves outside of our comfort zone. But I guess there is one need that is overarching for me that really is the most important for us, if you want to really think about this question of breaking down walls, is the need for dialogue. It's very simple. By dialoguing, discussing together is probably very central. And when I talk about dialogue, I'm thinking about the things we're doing today, having a biennial like this, discussing, listening to amazing presenters, having the possibility to discuss, to have these feedbacks coming from our listeners today. And I was thinking of that when last Tuesday evening I went to Liberal Judaism Council, and someone said, hold on, we are calling it a biennial, but we did it last year. So it's not really a biennial if we do it every year. And I think she was so right. And I think we probably need this more now as a movement to meet again more frequently and to put everything on the table. Everything has to be discussed. So later on, we will discuss about, do we need boundaries, or what are the limits of it? So I'm not going to go there. But if you think about dialogue, there's the dialogue among leaders, whether lay leaders, rabbinic leaders, which is very important. And we're doing this all the time with the Conference of Liberal Rabbis and Cantors, which I have the honor to co-chair with Rabbi Rebecca Burke. But it's also dialogue within a community, dialogue with our members, discussing constantly. And I wanted to reflect on the project we did at Kingston Liberal Synagogue. We had a great project, which of course with COVID had to be changed. We created a project called the Rabbis Roadshow. So I didn't come up with a name, but I thought it was a very good idea. So we identified 16 places in our communities where I would go and meet our congregants and discuss openly with them. So we did this online, and we had over 2/3 of the community involved in that, which is just amazing to have so many people coming together. And many good ideas came out of this dialogue. And I think we have a vision. It's important to have a vision, but there is this passage in the Talmud, Puk and Chesed, go out and see what the people want. And I think that's also very important to keep in mind. And I just, I had a kind of metaphor coming to my mind when I was thinking of that. It's chocolate mousse. I'm a big fan of chocolate mousse, but think about it. You have chocolate on one side, you have white eggs on the other side, and when you blend them together, you have to do it very carefully. You can't do it too quickly, because if you do it too quickly, it's become liquid. It's not good. And if you do it too slowly, then you lose the momentum. So I guess our movement is sweet, is nice, is tasty, and it's like a chocolate mousse that we need to make sure that it remains tasty for all of us. Thank you.
Rabbi René, thank you so much. And anyone who is going to talk about chocolate mousse, particularly on a Friday afternoon, you had me at hello, I think is what I'll say. Some amazing thoughts there. And actually, I'll take a moment to say, when you speak about dialogue and the importance of dialogue and really knowing what the other in the conversation, or even not in the conversation yet, thinks and feels, this is a moment of pride for me as a liberal Jew, to be taking on this, to be challenging ourselves and saying, let's just take a look around. Are we speaking? Are we reaching? Who are we speaking to? Are we in our own echo chambers, which I lead an organization in the Jewish community. Some of us spend far too long in our own echo chambers. And here we are a liberal Jewish community taking on these issues. And that dialogue and starting the dialogue makes me feel very proud to belong. I will turn to you now, Shaan. I'll restate the question in case anyone's joining us, so they're up to where we are. It's, what is the one thing that's really top of your priority list that you think will make an ability to create one Jewish space out of many Jewish identities, voices, and perspectives?
Yeah, thanks for that, and hello everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here, and I mean, having had before me 2 rabbis, so yeah, I'll try to, yeah. So most of you will know me. I run heritage projects for Liberal Judaism at the moment, Lily's Legacy, but I'm also, in my other life, a equalities campaigner, as we say, equity, inclusion, diversity these days. And I want to just really, I want a practical approach. It's not really the direct answer to your question, Michelle, but the one thing I feel I want us to be more head-on, to be more calling out things, and I think the philosophical and approach in all this, we need that too. So it's kind of more like on a multi-level intersectional approach I'm talking about. But I want to pick out on this one thing, and I feel that we need to be more observing us as humans, as individuals in this community more, and we need to give each other space, and we need to also call each other out and allow that in a way that it is not leading in any way to arguments, but to healthy debate. That's why I really like that hot potato concept that we've been working on recently, and I think this also is meant to be a bit a hot potato debate, as far as I got the brief right. So I think we should get hotter here, and I think it's really healthy to have more hot potatoes. And I'm joining now here Rabbi René's food examples. So I think we need to spice the hot potato with more chili, and face that chili. I mean, call it out, say it is a chili and it is hot, and there are different opinions in this room, and some people may not be feeling comfortable. And in fact, it was a lot of the stuff that Rabbi Charlie said in the opening here. We need to also face those things. So, for example, I'm giving you more like a sort of a tangible example. I deal a lot, as you know, with LGBTQI plus stuff. And a lot of the times I feel that because we have done some really pioneering work, and in that respect, of people feel, oh no, we've been there, we've done that, we are great, you know, we took that T-shirt, we are completely LGBTQI inclusive. However, I have so many examples of personally as well to feel that I have not been completely included or respected even. I've had what I would call bullying, and I've spoken about it to people. I felt excluded in certain communities, our liberal communities, and I'm not quiet about it, but also I feel sometimes I run a little bit against walls, because people say, oh, what are you saying? Because, you know, LGBT, no problem, you know. There may be a couple of individuals, but it's not something that really concerns liberal Judaism. And not everyone says that. I think there are brilliant people I have spoken to, and I think that should be another hot potato. In fact, Rabbi Charlie and I, we're planning some really hot potato sofa sessions on these things. So let's talk about sex, baby, basically. So we're going to tackle that, but I do feel there are walls still, and there is a lot of let's call it sort of, you know, pussyfooting around these things, and having that excuse that we've done already so much. Not everyone is included on the LGBTQI plus table. And by just saying the acronym, for example, I've checked on some communities' websites where it just says, well, LGBTQI plus, for example, but do people really actually, for example, know what the I is? What is intersex? And what kind of programs, activities, you know, have we actually, you know, incorporated? Do we know what we do if somebody, for example, who's non-binary joins us? You know, do we actually, and I prompted this here in my, how do you call that little, where the name is, the name tag thing. I put my pronouns in here. Not because perhaps I assume that nowadays I would probably pass in the he, him category. However, you know, I'm making no assumptions about other people and their pronouns. Perhaps, you know, you look or sound in a different way to what you would like to be called in terms of the gender pronouns. So I think it's a tiny little thing that maybe some people find ridiculous, but it means a lot for some people. And I think it's little things that we can start with. But I think what I'm trying to get back to is this, the food thing, is to call out, to put more chili on the hot potato, and be more mindful about the fact that we have not challenged ourselves enough, and we have not challenged others enough. That's what I meant by the calling out things as well. But it is also a personal journey, and I'm the first person. I'm working at the moment, for example, on being a great ally to Black people, because there's a lot going on, and we know that since last year, especially, Black Lives Matter. And I always thought I'm an ally, you know, doesn't matter, you know. But I realized, am I really an active, proactive, you know, ally to the Black community, or Black communities and Black people in our community and outside our community? And I had to answer myself honestly, I am not. And I really want to work on that. So yes, you know, I could go on and on, but I'll just pass on the mic and wait for the next opportunity.
Thank you so much, and we will come back to you. I just want to take a moment to reflect a little. First of all, to thank you for opening up in that way, and for us to just take a moment to acknowledge and to hear that someone has said in our community, I don't always feel comfortable and I don't always feel included. And for us to just hear that is really important. And to thank you, Shaan, for saying it in this public space. It's really vital, because if we are going to challenge ourselves, we need to get uncomfortable. We need to shift around in our chair. We need to feel a little bit like, this is pushing me. It's pushing me a bit to think, as you say, are we really allies? What does that mean? So let's get a bit uncomfortable. I'm loving the food stuff. So let's add a bit of chili to the potatoes and the chocolate mousse. I mean, sometimes we can do chocolate and chili as well. So we'll go with that combination. What does inclusion really mean? I was struck also by the small things. Actually, small things can make a real difference. So what are the small changes? Maybe each one of us present here today will leave with a small thing that we will carry through, and that can snowball. Small actions. I put my pronouns not here today, but on my email, you know, on other panels that I've been. What are the small things that we can do? Rabbi Leah, lots to think about in our first three panelists. I also, Shaan, feel a little bit like I need to go and get smicha before I can join another forum like this, but we'll work on that. But Rabbi Leah, please, we'll turn to you now.
Thank you so much, Michelle. Yeah, already, how can I even add on the one hand to that? Rabbi Alex saying it's about theology. It's a question of theology and of multi-spaces rather than a unispace, which I thought was fascinating. And René, very French with the chocolate mousse metaphor and about it being dialogue. That really resonates. And then Shaan, yes, that we have to challenge ourselves and each other, and that we need to be a bit more spicy. I really take that to heart. You reminded me to put my pronouns in my title, for one thing. So I got a little bit of a jump start, I think, in the sense that I was part of co-programming this panel and asking people to come. So Michelle told me very early on, this was the question, is if you could wave your magic wand and something would miraculously change in British Jewish life, what would it be? Which is kind of how I'm taking this question. So for me, it would be putting Torah and Torah learning back at the heart of Jewish community. And that's very broad and can mean a lot of things. And so I kind of wanted to explain what I mean by that. I think if we succeed in doing that, and I'll explain what I mean by it, then three things may happen. We as Jews will be more empowered if Torah learning is at the heart of our life, and I'll talk about why that is. We as Jews will have put back at the center of Jewish life what is, I think, at the center of it, as opposed to other things that sometimes we spend more time on, I think, than that. And that three, Torah is ours, and it's what makes us distinctive. It's what created Jewish life and Jewish tradition in some ways, or it was co-created by and with. And I think that it is what we have to offer. And so I mean Torah in the most broad sense. I think, for example, that Rabbi B'nai Lappi talking tonight about how Judaism is a queer radical project to innovate and disrupt the DNA of our master narratives is Torah. In the same way that I think Charlotte Fisher coming tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. and teaching us with Shea Akiwowo about anti-racism for Jewish communities, when Charlotte brings Rabbi Heschel and talks about anti-racism through the lens of Torah. Again, I think that that's an example of Torah. So I think Torah can be social action, but I think it also can be empowering. So that's the first thing. I think that progressive Jews have given Torah over to the Orthodox. We've said, that's your thing, you go and you learn that, and we don't know it. I think that's a terrible mistake, and I think that we need to take back the reins of that. And I know that's not totally true, and not totally true at any of your shuls or at mine, but it is more broadly true than I would like it to be. And of course, the challenge to the Orthodox is the Orthodox need to open up the Torah to more people. They need to make it more egalitarian and accessible for all genders and for non-Orthodox folks and for folks who are coming to learn in a way that is not currently the case either in the Orthodox world. And if we do that, we will all feel more empowered. We'll have more access and we'll be able to innovate because we'll know more about our stories and our histories and our projects, and we'll be able to be more fully Jewishly involved. The second thing, as I said, is that then we put at the center of our life neither social action and tikkun olam, which is very important, and neither the state of Israel, which is important to some and important to me in fascinating and interesting and difficult ways, but is not important to everybody. And it's something Rabbi Alex already mentioned in some ways, that I think sometimes we put social action in the state of Israel at the heart of our Judaism in Britain in a way that those things are both very important in different ways, inarguably, but they're not the center of our Judaism. It has to be spirituality and Torah and theology and dialogue, all those things that were mentioned. And then finally, it's ours and it's our distinctiveness. And I've been thinking a lot about anti-Semitism over the past few years and how we've had a lot of refugees come to us at Kahila, at my community in Stoke Newington, and also into Na'amod, this British Jewish movement that I organize with, who have said, I'm here because I've felt anti-Semitism in the past 5 years, and I want to organize as a Jew. And I think that the response, and other people have came to this conclusion before me, is to anti-Semitism is, well, then you are proud and you show what is distinct about your Jewishness. And I think the Torah is fundamental to that. And I mean by that, I mean ways that we tell the stories that are literally in the first 5 books, to the way that we learn Talmud, to the way that we teach about liturgy and prayer in our communities. And even what we're all doing right now is Torah. You know, it's part of adding on to the commentary and the conversation in the Jewish world. And we only can do that from a place of putting learning at the center. So if I could wave my magic wand and everybody would learn more Torah, however they define that, that would be my British Jewish change.
Thank you so much. Again, so very much to reflect on. And I think I'm struck by there was a question in there for me, which is, what do we hold at the heart of our Judaism? So where do we anchor ourselves? Where is that? Is that with a place? Is it with a book? Is it with a community? So I think there's a big question for us that you've left us there with, which is, what is at the heart? And I have in my mind the taking back the reins of Torah that you talked about, and how the potential to innovate, to be empowered, to be more involved. Thank you all for those kind of first moments for us to reflect. There's a few things that we've heard in the chat, just to let you know, so in case you've missed it, some appreciation for sharing, which is wonderful, an appreciation of being uncomfortable with things. It's good for us to feel uncomfortable, but thank you all for sharing. There's a question around, are we familiar with the phrases of calling out and calling in, and the distinction between and how we can be helpful to think about how we bring problems, and actually to reflect back on what Rabbi René, you talked about with the dialogue, how we bring problem, how we frame, how we have challenges, who is part of the conversations, and how do we bring it, is a big part of how we demonstrate our values as a community. How we allow conversations to happen. Do we ask questions, open spaces? How do we allow, or how is it the culture of our community to encourage conversations? So there's lots. Please do share your comments in the chat, share your reflections. I'm going to ask you now, we talked a little about boundaries. I think it was Rabbi René, you talked a little about boundaries. I want us to think about boundaries now. And to think, if we're talking about widening our tent, the tent that expands far and wide across the UK for liberal Judaism, but to what extent should we really look to widen our tent? Because when we talk about community, we talk about probably a distinct space. There is a space. There are some boundaries there, aren't there? Communities hold spaces. Maybe my community is my home, my family, or the community I inhabit in SBJC, South Bucks Jewish Community, just giving another shout out there. But so when we look to widen our tent, how do we and should we retain boundaries that demonstrate our space, so it demonstrates the place we hold, but yet allows us to remain open and inclusive? How do we balance that? So how do we have boundaries that demonstrate our community, but also allow us to remain open and inclusive? And we'll go again through Rabbi Alex, Rabbi René first. So Rabbi Alex.
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. It's so interesting hearing everybody's comments on this question. And I think this question is really the other side of the coin of your first question, Michelle. And if I may, I'm going to take another text, this time a narrative text, in order to see how boundaries can be subverted and pushed for openness and inclusion, while at the same time the energy and momentum that drives forward the Jewish endeavour is not diminished. And I hope this sort of picks up some of the points that have been made by Shaan and Rabbi René and Rabbi Leah on discomfort and Torah learning, the centrality of Torah learning and the momentum of our community. And because Shavuot isn't far away, it occurs to me that in the book of Ruth, which we read at Shavuot, and please, you'll have to forgive the simplicity of these comments because of the constraints of time, we can see what you're asking at work. So who's Ruth? She's a woman without any social status. She's a widow. She's poor. To cap it all, she's a foreigner. And she's a Moabitess. She is a descendant of the incestuous union between Lot and one of his daughters. And this past, if you like, this mythic history leads to the Deuteronomist in the book of Deuteronomy prohibiting marriages between Israelites and Moabites. No Moabite shall enter the assembly of the Eternal One ever, no marriages. But she marries an Israelite. Her husband has died. She's returned with her mother-in-law Naomi to Bethlehem, to Judah. And every single legislative boundary to do with the status of this foreigner, this Moabitess, is broken down in this book. To cut a very long story short, she ends up marrying a kinsman of her late father-in-law, Boaz, and becomes no less than the ancestress of King David and the Messianic line. So in the book of Ruth, we have a narrative which constantly appears to be held back, as it were, by law, by ancient boundaries and prejudices about the Moabites, about who an Israelite is permitted to marry, about the status of a poor widow woman, a foreigner. Ruth poses a challenge to the world of Bethlehem. Where you go, I will go, she says to Naomi. Her very existence challenges the boundaries that defined the ancient Israelite world. And what I want to say really is that I think our community has always been challenged in this sort of way. There have always been things, there have always been people who've sought to push against boundaries, whether those boundaries are real or imagined. And that's allowed us as a community to live on the liminal. In a curious way, our story, the story of the Jewish people, powers its way along. We are a kind of Gulf Stream, distinctive, but part of the wider ocean. And I think we have to look at that sort of tension between boundaries, between tradition, law, and between our story and what it is that can power us along. And I think those things that have already been said by my colleagues on this panel, discomfort, the pearl in the oyster, if you like, the momentum and the challenges, particularly of, you talk about Torah learning, Rabbi Leah, the rabbinic imagination, I think, is constantly chafing against some of the constraints that halakha, that Jewish law, put before us. And it's in that tension that we find the richness of Jewish life.
Rabbi Alex, thank you so much. And apt, having just talked about bringing more of the study of Torah that you have brought to us as we approach Shabbat, two pieces of liturgy, of the theological thinking for us to think about. I'm struck by pushing of the boundaries, who is part of our community, how we welcome, how we make that, and the tension of boundaries that you struck upon. And managing that is no mean feat, and being conscious, just as we've talked about, of the conversation around it. Thank you so much. Rabbi René.
Thank you, Michelle. I think it was in the 1890s that Rabbi John Rayner from the LGS wrote a sermon where he talked about being liberal Jew, and he said we should be 100% Jewish and 100% liberal. This is why what Rabbi Leah said about putting Torah at the center really struck a chord to me, because I think we, as you said, we are a bit short on that. We don't do this enough, and the risk of that is to make a choice that are not that informed. That we make choice because we want to follow the zeitgeist, the feel of the day, because there are trendy stuff to do. I guess also the question for us is about being progressive. Is being religiously progressive the same thing as being progressive in modern Britain? Are we progressive the same way? And it's very important for us because we are a religious movement. And I saw just someone who commented on a post on the humanistic liturgy. Can it be part of a liturgy? Of course, yeah, of course, because it's also part of a larger Jewish conversation. But when we do these things, we really need to be mindful to understand why I'm doing that. What are my theological what is my theological background? What do I want to achieve? And I think this conversation, there's no shortcut for that. We can't go to easy solutions, 5 minutes video on one theological topic that will solve everything. It takes some deep study, and I think we really need as a movement to embrace this further. And we have everything here. I mean, we don't have to reinvent the wheel. We have all the people. We have rabbis who are, amazing colleagues. Then you have amazing congregants who really want to study. Since I've opened my classes online because of COVID, I think the number of people joining were multiplied by 4 or 5, and it's everywhere. So there is a thirst for learning. And I think that's very, very important for us as a movement to have a deep thinking on what liberal theology is. Where do we stand on all the theological problems which we have to face? Because it's about serving the Jewish people. It's about helping our people to move forward in this world which is changing so rapidly, and we need tools to be able to do that. Now, the question of boundaries. Yes, I'm not afraid of having boundaries, and I think clear boundaries can lead to clarity in purpose. Why do people join us? They join us because we stand here. And when I meet people who want to convert, for example, let's take this example. Sometimes I meet people who don't feel comfortable with the progressive approach of Judaism, and that's okay. We don't need to be everything for everybody. But we need to be very clear of who we are and what we are doing things. And if we're clear about that, if we have a strong theological based on Torah. Theological, when I came to this country, I never heard about theology in the Jewish context before coming to Britain, to be honest, because, in France, it's more traditional. So it's more Torah, mitzvot, and theology is for the Christians. But I think theology understood as a way to think about where we stand based on Torah is so important. And when we're sure where we are, who we are, and where we stand, I think we will be even more a beacon, because I think we have a unique voice in the Jewish religious community that works for some, not for all, and it's okay. But once we're sure about where we want to go, it will be probably amazing for us as a movement. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think I'm struck by the phrase you can't please all the people all the time. And that's okay. As you say, we are a community. We should be a community proud of the clarity of our purpose, of what we are trying to purposefully create here. We've had a couple of thoughts from the floor, which is Judaism comes from a place of mindfulness. Once we remember this, it should always help give a voice and respect to all. And we talked, you'd reflected a little about mindfulness. And there's a question here which we may not necessarily answer, but that poses, should we be including humanistic Jewish liturgy as an alternative service for the many, in capital letters, congregants who don't want theistic language or discourse? There's a reflection that this is very far ahead in the USA, but is that as far ahead as we would want it here? So just throwing out a couple of those questions. But I think the clarity of purpose that you talked about and the pride in that, the unashamed pride, I would go to say, is that here we are and this is good for us. This works. This space for us is great. Shaan, I will turn to you now. Just to answer that question again, how wide does the tent go? Where are the boundaries? Should we, do we, how do we push those or pull them in?
Yeah, so in a way, I hope that I don't repeat what Rabbi René was just saying. This is pretty much going that direction. So I was going to bring in a little image about the tent. I feel the tent, is wide enough, and it can be even wider. And if it's too small, then we buy a bigger tent. But what's really important is the foundation of the tent. For those of you who have been camping or slept in the desert like I have, and there's a big desert storm, and your tent blows away because you haven't hammered the nails properly in the ground, or you don't know how to put up the tent because you didn't read the instructions, which I sometimes don't, then that goes very, very wrong. So, and I think, although I think we've done really well, and but we could do better. So by, for example, reading the instructions, I mean also writing the instructions in a way that people understand them, and when they buy that tent, they know they have to do that to secure the tent. So I think, for example, we could start with having clearer policies on equity, inclusion, and diversity for a start, being really aware of that, and not just fitting into legislation of this country, but in terms of community, a community perspective on these things. So I think the first start for me to enable that, this tent is having, like, to go through our policies, guidelines, and make sure that everyone is all the communities are signed up. But that's not enough, of course, because on paper, there's a lot of things on paper, really, but we need to then put that into action. For example, we could have programs, self-initiated learning opportunities in communities that would deal with these issues that we have put down in our policies. For example, training in communities, we talks, programs on, for example, anti-bullying strategies, which are readily available. There's some wonderful organizations and other charities, some of them maybe non-faith, but we could collaborate. We could look outside. We could bring in people who give us more tools, and then we could sit down and talk about that openly with each other. And obviously we need the help of the rabbis, but also community leaders. I think we should all be part of that, and not just leave it to the rabbis or the gatekeepers and the communities, which sometimes happens, I believe. There's someone at the entrance of the tent, and and you feel like, I can't really speak up because I'm not really, one of the big bodies in there. So I think, to be truly inclusive, we got to really get down from the paper level of rewriting our policies, down to talking about them in our communities, having programs, having people, inviting people, training programs, and so on and so forth. And I think then it will be self-selective, because as I believe it was René also was saying, that people who don't want to sign up for this and say, no, actually, that's not what I believe in, and that's not what I want to do, then they will go somewhere else. But that's fine, because then other people will come into the tent and say, hey, I really like that. And when they see what we stand for, and they see it clearly, and they see it clearly also not only on paper but in action, then we'll have a wonderful group in that tent. And so I think boundaries, we don't really need them. We need great foundations.
Well, that's amazing to leave us. So we don't need boundaries, we need great foundations. Thank you so much, Shaan. So much to think about there. Grappling with, I did say to one of my children the other day, when you become a parent, there's no instruction manual. So as you said, there is no instruction manual. We need to write the instructions ourselves. We need to frame those conversations to allow them and to think about what it means, the clarity of policy, collective agreement, the expectations. And I think a really interesting point that you touched on, which is really looking outside. One of the leadership development tools I use is Appreciative Inquiry, which is when you are faced with challenge, don't focus on the challenge, but focus on where you see it working well. Where is there success in this area? And there is success, both within our community and outside. So let's use Appreciative Inquiry. Rabbi Leah, we will pass over to you to have some closing thoughts before I wrap up on the boundaries of our tent.
Yeah, some of what I'm going to say is going to echo people, so that'll hope I can keep that part brief and then just add a little bit. To your last point, Michelle, about this notion that we have to look around and see where it's being done well rather than to focus on the challenges. I hope that that's some of the conversation that you are igniting this weekend and that will carry on over the course of the weekend, which is that we're bringing in people, including all of ourselves here, to challenge ourselves. And then we're also going to bring in people who, like everybody here as well, are modeling in different ways the answers to these questions. So we have a lot of great speakers who are going to lead the way on that. And the one that came to mind for us as liberal Jews, is LJY, the Liberal Jewish Youth. I really think on questions of inclusion and on how wide is the tent and where are we getting it wrong and where do we need to redraw the boundaries. When I was university chaplain for 5 years for Liberal Judaism in a past life, and I would go out every summer to the summer camp to LJY, and I would watch them do what we keep on saying is inclusion in action here on the weekend, but do it for 3 weeks. And really, it was about all sorts of different things. It was about accessibility and ability and disability, and it was about gender, and it was about class, and it was about all sorts of other identities and I think tent questions of how do we make this the place for all of our liberal Jewish youth. And I hope we can learn a lot from them. And I think also, just to say, in the question of how do we retain boundaries or should we retain boundaries, I'm always more interested in who are we, which kind of echoes some of what Rabbi René said. Rather than to worry about where are the borders, who are we, and are people feeling that they are centered and uplifted for who they are in our community. And I think that's a question of equity, to what Shaan talked about, that equity is this ongoing process, as I've been explained by people who understand this better than I, that what it is a consistent process of centering and uplifting people in our community who have been marginalized, and that it continues, and then there's no moment of self-congratulation, then it's ongoing work. And I hope we're doing some of that, and I think we just need to push forward. And then with my co-chair hat, the last thing I wanted to say is, I don't know if it was Rabbi René, Rabbi Alex mentioned we need more theology on this. Rabbis Judith Rosenberry speaking tonight and Eli Tikvaser speaking tomorrow morning are both speaking on this question, I think, that Biennial poses about theology of inclusion and about a liberal Judaism for the 21st century. And I'm very excited because I think they're going to also give us some great answers. So please don't miss that. That's all I'll say.
Thank you so very much. I suppose I have a few thoughts that I'll share in a second, but I will also invite each of you, and Rabbi Leah, you touched on this when you opened. I will ask you, if you had a magic wand, what is the one change you would want to instantly see? So while you think about your brief answer to that, I'm just going to reflect on a couple of questions. Tamara, who has talked about if we're too narrow in who we imagine might be our possible membership. So do we need to expand, invite more? Maybe people who are not yet Jewish and consider becoming so. And we've got Michelle, who says, I think our boundary should not include some. So talking about Knesset members prevented from being standing in elections, and remembering our own principles. So reminding ourselves that we have boundaries, and that's okay, as we spoke about. You talked about self-selection. So how narrow should we be? How wide should we be going? And also, let's remind ourselves that it's okay. We can't please all the people all the time, and people will want to be part of something that we build. So before I close, Your magic wand moments. If you had a magic wand, what is the one change that you would like to see? And we will go in reverse order this time. So I'm going to go back to you, Rabbi Leah. I know you touched on it before, but we'll go in reverse order. Rabbi Leah, then Shaan.
Well, you know my answer. I really would like Talmud Torah, the study of Torah, to be at the heart of Jewish life, and it is, and it isn't enough at the heart of our life. And the reason that is because Talmud Torah is keneged kulam. It is equal to doing everything right and living ethically and taking action, because it leads to doing everything right and living ethically and taking action. So that would be my answer.
Thank you so much. Shaan, your magic wand moment.
Oh, my magic wand removes all the egos and turns people into people who really want to be there for each other and listen to each other actively, and then become great allies for each other, regardless if they understand about other people's identities and lives. Just letting that sort of self go and be there for each other. That's my super magic wand.
Thank you so much. I'm excited by the super magic wand. René and then Alex. René, your magic wand moment.
Well, it's not an easy one. I think if I had a magic wand and I could use it, I would remove fear from our communities, fear of the other, fear of being brave. And I would also hold, if Leah allows me to do, I would also hold a magic wand, because I'm very fond of this idea.
Fabulous. Thank you, Rabbi Alex.
Yeah, I agree with all my colleagues, and I think that I do want us to see a sort of theological, or if you don't want to use the word theological, philosophical embeddedness as sort of the roots of our movement, the roots of our actions are embedded in a very deep and thoughtful theology or philosophy that includes an openness and an understanding of who we are, that doesn't necessarily reject those people who disagree with us. I think that we have to model a behavior, a conduct to others who don't necessarily share our ideas, in an attempt to persuade them that dialogue, understanding, tolerance, sensitivity, all those things are important in the movement that we are, Liberal Judaism.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Alex. I will take this moment to say I feel very honored to be invited to share this platform with you, with all of you, with leaders of my community, of our community today, to start the thinking. Remind ourselves we weren't here to solve problems. We were here to start the conversation, to move us through Shabbat, through our biennial, to keep grappling with the questions. I will thank each and every one of you who is part of these conversations now and as we continue through and beyond this biennial. It's inspiring and motivating to be part of a community that takes time and space to do this. So let's grapple with the questions, move forward with purpose and nurture these conversations. Shabbat Shalom to all of you. In a few minutes, we will be hosting Rabbis Danny Rich and Eryn London in the next session, which is titled, Can You Hear Me? Please do take a chance to look at the wealth of wonderful sessions on offer. Take time to experience the peace, the stillness, the learning of Shabbat together in our albeit virtual community space, which has come to be a moment in my week that I really treasure. Shabbat Shalom, and thank you all so much.
Thank you, Michelle.
Shabbat Shalom.
Thank you. Shabbat
Thank you.
Shalom.
Shalom.
Thank you, Michelle.
You're listening to Lily's Legacy, a podcast series compiled from oral histories and produced as part of a digital exhibition exploring how liberal Judaism has evolved since it was co-founded by British visionary Lily Montagu in 1902. This episode explores the theme of family background and finding liberal Judaism. In this series, you will hear the voices of liberal Jews as they share their experiences, views and visions. The first episode explores participants' family background and how they encountered liberal Judaism. It includes some of the stories about where they came from and the personal appeal of liberal Judaism. As you will hear, liberal Jews come from many places. Some are refugees or immigrants. Some are born into liberal Jewish families. Others are Jews by choice. All are united in finding a home within liberal Judaism. Following Lily Montagu's personal legacy, they all contribute to liberal Judaism's rich and varied heritage.
Well, you're interviewing me as you know me as Joanna Kessler. But when I was born in Vienna on the 20th of August 1929. My name was Inga Johanna Rubner, and that was the name that I was known by until I was 16. I grew up in Vienna in quite a nice flat in what was known as the third Bezirk, the third district. My father was a civil engineer. He had a good job. My mother had been ill all her life. She suffered from TB. She spent a lot of time in hospital. I was brought up to a large extent by my grandmother, my mother's mother. When I was 6 years old, I went to school. This was the local school, just up the road, which would have been 1935. And all was well at the school until Hitler came, and all the Jewish children were made to go to separate schools, to Jewish schools, and a little sort of cohort of parents used to accompany us. But in the end, those groups were attacked, so we stopped going to school. My father began to think of possibly coming to England. My uncle was a banker, quite a well-known banker in Vienna, and had a connection with the Westminster Bank in England. When my cousins came to England, finally, they also set about getting visas for the rest of the family. And one of those visas I got to come to England. Now, how was I going to get there? Nobody else had a visa. And my father advertised me in the Jewish Chronicle. And he got several replies. But he finally accepted an offer from a Jewish family in London, a doctor's family. This family was a part of the Liberal Jewish Synagogue. And the Liberal Jewish Synagogue at that time had a chairman, Lily Montagu. She was the chairman. She realized what was happening on the continent. She called a meeting and she said, "We must help." Several families came forward, and in fact the Liberal Jewish Synagogue made it possible for 3 children to come to England. I came from Vienna, another one came from, I think, Germany, and I'm not quite sure the third one came from. But anyway, the date finally came, and I was on one of the very first kinder transports leaving from Vienna. I'd thought a lot about it. I was going to take my games, I was going to show off, I was going to sing. I was really rather looking forward to it. But when the time came to say goodbye to my mother, it was really very painful. And my father took me to the station. There were lots of other children there, parents and grandparents. And he handed me over to the girl who was arranging my kinder transport. She was a 19-year-old girl, a Quaker, who had put herself in charge of the 7 children on the kinder transport. And off we went. My cousin was there to meet me and handed me over to my English family. I was unhappy, and then they decided to send me to boarding school. Boarding school was heaven, because if I was unhappy, so were a whole lot of other people. And the boarding school was run by a Quaker lady, and I spent a happy term there. I think my family obviously were members of the Liberal Jewish Synagogue, and the other 2 families who also paid for me were in fact rabbis of the Liberal Jewish Synagogue. So technically I must have been made a member when I was 9 years old. When I went to boarding school, the Liberal Jewish Synagogue used to send me correspondence so that I could do the religion classes which were being held for children at the synagogue. I think any children at that time evacuated or at boarding schools received these correspondence courses. Apart from that, I didn't really have a link with the Liberal Jewish Synagogue. And in fact, when I went to Swanage, I had to go to church as well, and I got a bit annoyed as having to do Jewish correspondence classes as well as having to go to church. But I went on doing them. And the Liberal Jewish Synagogue at that time did not believe in bar mitzvah. They felt that children were not old enough at age 13 to commit themselves to any religion. That should wait until they were 16. So no bar mitzvahs or bat mitzvah at the LJS. But there was a confirmation at 16. And in fact, I came to London when I was 16. And I was there in time for my confirmation and also for the week before when classes were held for the confirmation service. And so in 1946, I was confirmed at the Liberal Jewish Synagogue, where obviously I continued as a member, but not as a very interested member, I must admit.
I was born in King's College Hospital, Denmark Hill, 90 years ago. And oddly enough, I was there 20 years ago to welcome my granddaughter, who lives in Dulwich. My father, Sam, was born in 1904. He was
Hello.
Hi, how are you?
I'm doing well. So hi, everyone out there watching. Welcome to Breaking Down the Walls. I'm Rabbi Eryn London, and here's Rabbi Danning Rich. And today we're talking about calling out, chaplaincy, volunteering, pastoral care in the community.
Yeah, great. I mean, when I was reflecting on, I thought because you do hospitals and hospices and I do prisons and hospitals, I thought maybe I'd start with a prison reflection when you were ready to think about the nature of prison and the nature of lockdown. Now, they're clearly not the same thing, but clearly there are aspects of prison and aspects of lockdown which have some things in comparison. One is that many people have found themselves quite alone, isolated from people that they're used to and the systems they're used to. Second, many of them found they've got much more time to be thinking than they might have done before. And I think for many of them, as in prison, that this season of lockdown is a challenging one. Now, prisoners, of course, in some cases during lockdown were locked up literally in their cells for 23 hours a day. We're assuming that a lot of our people weren't literally locked in rooms for 23 hours a day, but nevertheless, there is a similarity with being removed from your usual sources of support. And that's what was my initial reflection. And when you're ready, and we might want to think about this in other contexts, I was just thinking about the 4 types of prisoners that were identified by a survey by Cardiff University about some time ago now in 2011, and how they relate to the type of people that we are going to be seeing, I suspect, of course, looking to the future, in our congregations going forward, who are going to need pastoral support. At the moment, of course, it's impossible to predict who we're going to see, because we just don't know. But I am reflecting on who might our pastoral systems, and that includes the work you're doing in training lay volunteers and our rabbis and our care workers, who are they going to be seeing, or what are their states of mind? And that's what I was thinking about in terms of these 4 types of prisoners.
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about also the idea of isolation and lockdown, and this continued feeling of shut offness. And I think similarly, as you're explaining your experiences working with people who are in prison, working with people in hospitals and also hospice, of being taken out of their space of comfort, whether that's their home or being able to regularly interact with their family, friends, loved ones, workspace. All of a sudden, what they used to do all the time isn't happening, can't happen. And, you know, sometimes in the hospital, even pre-COVID, people were put onto isolation precautions and were in their room without being able to walk outside. And the only people walking in were covered from head to toe. And so you weren't ever feeling the hand of someone else or seeing the smile of someone else, because being able to do that would have also been dangerous for your own self.
Sure. I mean, it is interesting, isn't it? I mean, the theme is breaking down walls, I think, and clearly, I've always had a metaphorical vision about breaking down prison walls, and actually, prisons need to be seen like local hospitals. That there's one in every community, because you know the people behind the prison walls, and they're easy to forget behind the prison walls. Until recently, they didn't even have votes in this country, but behind the prison wall, they're easy to forget. And of course, prison walls exist, but that doesn't mean that prisoners have to be completely isolated from the community. And the biggest challenge for most prisoners, other than their own mental health, which they go in with mental health problems, never mind what they're going to need in hospitals and hospitals when they come out, is their isolation from everybody. Their lack, we pride, we want them to go out and have community ties, but the reality is most of the community ties are broken, depending how long they're in prison for, of course. And interestingly, thinking about your hospital and hospice work, for the first time now, we've got older prisoners. It used to be very rare to see old prisoners. I mean, prisoners who are physically old, but the prison service is now adapting prisons with lifts and wheelchair suitable doors, and people to help older prisoners shower and all sorts of things, because it's realizing, particularly after a series of historic child sex cases in this country, a lot of older, particularly men, few women, but primarily men, have found themselves in prison. And the estate, literally the physical estate, has had to adapt the fact that not only these people are in prison, but now they've got other physical impairments to getting around even within the wall, never mind getting outside of the wall.
Yeah. Wow. That's a fascinating thing to be thinking about, of how one has to adapt those spaces. And I think, thinking about lay pastoral care, lay volunteers, and also for rabbis, cantors, care managers, visiting and taking care of community members, of what needs and can be adapted based on the changing realities. Both some could be positive, right? Many more people are used to Zoom or FaceTime or what have you, which is a little bit, for some people, is a little bit different and feels a little bit closer than a phone call. For other people, it feels the most bizarre thing. It actually feels more distant. But I think it also thinking about how can we reach out to those people who, for all the reasons, are not able to come into our spaces. And in many cases, there have always been and always will be people in our communities that have not been able to reach our space.
I guess since we're talking about reaching spaces, we should say, I think, that people can can send comments and questions, and it can contribute to this space, as it were, in our debate. I mean, we can't have live conversations with them apparently, but they can send questions and comments that we can pick up as we're going through. That is if anybody's...
I just saw a response, a comment here by Elizabeth Storrs. The feeling of social isolation experienced by many during lockdown are part of the day-to-day realities of many people living with a range of disabilities.
And that would include both physical and mental unwellness.
Right.
I mean, she's absolutely right. I mean, and we might actually be able to use the experience of disabled, what she calls people living with a range of disabilities, to actually help us articulate and best respond to. Because if you've already been through it and experienced it, of course, in some sense, you're an expert in the experience, at least. And I hope that some of the people that you will pick up in your work, training lay persons in chaplaincy and lay persons in congregational pastoral support, will actually be people who've been through some of these experiences. Because, of course, you don't have to go through every experience to be able to support people going through experiences, but having some real experience can usually enhance, not hinder the support one's able to provide to others.
Yeah, it gives a deeper understanding and knowledge of what's out there. I agree very much so. But
I think, I mean, the challenge to me is, if I just briefly talk about these 4 categories of prisoners, and then
please
explain how I think that they're in our communities now in a different way. I mean, obviously, I'm not comparing prison with lockdown, and I'm not comparing lockdown with communal life, but I'm trying to see if there are common threads. And this survey in I think it was in 1911, the survey of prisoners done by Cardiff identified 4 types of inmates, that's what they're called, prisoners, who utilize chaplaincy services. They said the first are those who are devout. They're described as devout. That means they arrive with a clear religious expression, which they wish to just continue when they're inside as when they were outside. That's group 1. Group 2 are also well-known, a group who converts. In other words, they start with nothing, but somehow in prison they find faith. The third group says are returners, those who begin in prison and with a lot of time to reflect, to reconnect usually with their childhood faith in some sense or another. Actually, there are 5 groups. The fourth are agnostics. They have no particular faith, but they're professional seekers. In other words, they're just interested in those aspects of life and tour around. And the fifth are opportunists who simply use the chaplaincy as a safe space to escape from the wings. And I was reflecting on these 5 and thinking, what are the parallel? If I look at, I mean, I've been serving 2 and now a 3rd community. I've been serving 3 counties, which covers a wide geographical area. But I was appointed in October and I haven't managed to go there yet. So the only experience that they have of me and I have of them in this period, same at Stevenage, is on Zoom and during lockdown. And I was reflecting on, when I get back to the community, or even now, what will the rabbis and the lay chaplaincy volunteers that we're training and the people already out there doing the work, what types of people will they encounter? And I was thinking of, I drew parallels, and I was thinking that the person who goes into a prison as devout and remains the same is rather like our regular congregant. They're the ones who are there all of the time. And whether they're in lockdown or whether they're out of lockdown, most of them, they're the regular few. In every community, there are, of course, regulars who are there, usually we call it by, whether the sun comes out or it pours with rain. That would be one group. Then the converts, I was thinking, I mean, I'm sure you've experienced this, and certainly my congregational colleagues experience, people who just emerge out of the blue. They'll be what in prison sense would be a convert. In other words, we have no knowledge of their history, and we have no evidence of them having any religious background, or they might, but suddenly they appear on our Zoom screens on a regular basis, some of them. So we don't actually know, other than they've locked into our or come into our Zoom space, usually, what it is they require from the congregation. And they may not require, they may not require anything, I don't know, but I was just thinking there's about a second group. The third group I would call the returners, are the people who have always been members on paper. We all, let's be honest, we all have Shaan members and we rely on them to pay their subscriptions. They don't make very many demands of us. But who during this period in lockdown, for whatever reason, have started appearing on our screens. So they might not have previously come regularly to Shaan services, but all of a sudden we're seeing them on screens. Now, I'm not making any assumptions about people we see on screens, other than there is an opportunity to contact with them, and they might want some support or not some support as we all come out of lockdown, which of course is somebody's just pointed out, is in itself a whole major issue. The agnostic, I thought, was, and we do get them, particularly on Zoom, people who, just are looking around, are regularly checking out, and it's so much easier to check out on Zoom when these things are public. You get less of them physically coming to the shul, but actually I suspect we'll have more of those. And I was trying to reflect on the opportunist. I suppose the opportunist is just somebody who wants a safe space. What does that mean? And what will it mean going forward for our communities, and particularly the volunteers that you're training? Will they only see regular members, or will they see members on the periphery, or will they see people who are, converting but need pastoral support, or will they see agnostics who are looking for something? So I thought that might be a helpful way for me of thinking about how, and I don't want to take the metaphor too far, but just the type of people that we might be required to assist and to support, to be alongside in the new lockdown, which is scary for lots of people. Lots of people. I've been reading articles about people who've lost their social skills. I don't know whether that's true or not, but I was reading an article about people are nervous about going out again. They're nervous about dating again. They're nervous about some of them meeting family they haven't seen for a long time. So that there may be a lot of work.
I think there's going to be a lot of work going back into those spaces, whether that is being able to interact with each other again, but also I think the fear. There's been a lot of fear of catching this virus and what this virus might do. And that fear, I think, lives within us because we've seen such travesty over the past year. I would also add one more type of person. I actually really like this breakdown of people. And I'd add one more group, that those who aren't asking for help, but need it.
Right.
The group of people who are there, and for whatever reason, whether they don't know that there is support, they're too afraid to ask for support. They don't have the energy to ask for support,
and of course, by the way, they exist in prisons. They don't seek out. This was a survey to seek out people who seek out chaplaincy services. You're absolutely right. In the prisons, there are people who hide in their cells because they're frightened. There are all sorts of other people who don't seek out chaplaincy services. They may simply be cynical about it, or they may be fearful of it, or they may be not trusting of it. So you're absolutely right. It's a group that I need to add as my sixth one, because it isn't in the Cardiff literature.
We'll make an amendment. And then when I think about communal support, it's, in some ways it's relatively easy to think about how do we help those that we know who are in need. But then it's an extra step, which is hard. And I don't think I have an answer for this yet. of how do we offer support to those who we don't know about, or who aren't seeking but do need help.
I suppose if you trained enough volunteers in each community, I mean, clearly it depends on the size of your community. My view has always been that once a rabbi gets past about 250 members, they can't actually service the community on their own as sole practitioner, even though we know that many of our rabbis are sole practitioners with much larger numbers doing heroic work, and others supported by others too. So it'd be very interesting to ask you how many if I've got a community, let's say in 3 counties, that's Gloucestershire, Herefordshire, and Worcestershire, of 160 people, how many trained volunteers do I need to support a part-time rabbi like me who's only there 1 weekend a month? And that's thinking about that would enable us possibly, because it's partly about, the group who don't ask are partly that they don't ask, and it's partly that we don't ask them, and it's partly because simply by the time you've responded to the emergencies, and then you've responded to the ones that you know about, and then you've responded to the ones that you suspect you should know about, it's the ones that you don't ever get to who are partly a victim of resources. Now, it's not only resources, of course. I have seen some communities have done some quite good stuff in, at least as a minimum, making sure that people are in touch geographically, by setting up little satellite groups, which go some way to at least seeing there's some contact. Now, and of course, without initial contact, you're never going to get to the people who we don't know about.
Very much so. And so for everyone who doesn't know, I'm the program director for the Lay Chaplaincy Development Program with Reform Judaism and Liberal Judaism. And we are working to create a training for lay pastoral care to offer greater volunteer services and pastoral care from lay people throughout the communities in Reform and Liberal Judaism. So we're thinking very much about how do we contact people, what are the needs of communities, also what are the amazing things that communities have been doing up until this point, because I've spoken to many communities across the country and they're doing pretty amazing stuff, creating phone trees, creating house calls, making sure people have milk and regular groceries, and visits to hospitals and hospice, and taking that all under them on their own, which I don't know. It's really amazing, regardless of how large or small a community is, because it's a lot run by volunteers, which means they also have their own jobs and family life and all the other things we all do, and to volunteer to take up that time to hold someone else, hold their emotions, and sit with them in their time of suffering, and break down those walls. Yeah. We're thinking. Yeah, sorry.
No, carry on.
I was going to say, is as I'm thinking about, why are we talking about, breaking down walls, and what does that have to do with chaplaincy and pastoral care? It's, well, how do we break down that wall to sit with someone, whether that's the wall of the other person or our own wall of how difficult but also amazing that is when we're able to sit in the suffering of someone else with someone else. As a supervisor, I was just going to say, as a supervisor of mine used to say, is the job of a chaplain is to sit in the pit. It's not to pull the person out of the pit, it's to sit in the pit for as long as that other person needs a person in that pit with them. Yeah. Which is the hardest thing about.
I noticed there was a question about religious boundaries, about crossing religious boundaries. And as it happens, I serve as generic chaplain in a hospital in Southwest London, where in fact I very rarely see Jews. But having said that, there are times when I will refer mine or my patients to. It is true that a person needs a person, but sometimes they need a person with a particular understanding. And in my time in the prisons, I've referred, I've invited an Orthodox rabbi to come in to see an Orthodox prisoner, not because I couldn't do the job, but because I thought they would be best able to relate to somebody who understood their system. Of course, sometimes they want to be outside of the system deliberately, so they actually want a rabbi who's not so. But in my hospital chaplaincy, where, as I say, I do one long day shift a week, the overwhelming majority of patients I see are not Jews. In fact, very few Jews. That we celebrate when we get a Jew in hospital, because it means that actually that's what they keep the rabbi for. But in practice, most of my chaplaincy work is, as indicated by some of the comments, it's about crossing religious boundaries. Because, as you say, chaplaincy is not, it can be, and pastoral support can be particularly faith-based, but very often that's not what's most important. It's the humanity and the person of the person in the pit with you is more important than whether they share your stripe, your particular religious stripe. That is assuming, of course, and as we know in our communities, never mind in the wider context, many people wouldn't describe themselves in religious terms at all. I mean, under the NHS Charter and under the prison service charters, we are obliged to serve everybody, whether they claim to have a religious denomination or not, provided they don't turn us away. They're entitled to say, no, thank you very much, you're a religious nutter, we don't want anything to do with you, or no, I don't need any support from you. But other than that, we are obliged to serve everybody. And many people, as you know, even in our own community, even our own so-called religious communities, never mind outside, will not express themselves in particularly religious needs. They will, and Phyllis has made the point from Manchester, they need some active listening to begin with. As I know that you can comment on teaching active listening. That is, in many ways, the key to what we're doing. Presence, simply being there, of course. As you say, being in the pit, I would say, creating a safe space, or even our chaplaincy our hospital talks about being alongside, but they're the same points to be made. That
getting in the boat.
Yeah, a human being requires another human being. But having good listening skills is, as has just been indicated by, I think it was Phyllis from Manchester, nice to hear from you, Phyllis, is of course, and I'm sure, I think the question really was to you about, are you teaching it on your course? And I'm sure the answer is yes, but I'm going to leave you to answer that rather than me.
So I'm going to answer two things. One is that, the question about restricted along religious divides, I actually wholeheartedly don't believe so. My training and work as a chaplain was in a hospital in New York, and I joke but was serious that I saw and spoke to any person who was legally allowed to be in the building and was willing to talk to me. And at times I was potentially the only chaplain in the building because we were there 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and rotated who was there. And there were times I would refer patients that I met to my colleagues, and they would do the same thing. And when I think about either the people that I prayed with that were not of the Jewish faith, or the people that I sat and spoke about music or TV or art or nature, or theater, who were not of any religion that they decided to attach themselves with or believe in or what have you, it was all of that was pastoral care. And I firmly believe that people can be with people. And also even pray with people and be part of religious experiences, even when that religious experience is not of my own faith.
I think that's true.
In terms of, yeah. Oh yeah, sorry.
I just remember once being a chaplain on a refugee project where virtually everybody was, not exclusively, but virtually everyone was a Muslim from Syria. No, occasionally there were others, but that was primarily the target, the group who were coming, because they were placed there by the Home Office. And they had a multi-faith chaplaincy team, and we all took duty rota. Now, clearly, obviously, if I'm asked to do Islamic prayers, I can't do them and wouldn't pretend to do them. But most of the time, you know, they want to talk about their human experience, their fear of coming to a different country, their fear of death, which of course is particularly true, not necessarily fear of death, but the how to die, let me put it that way. They may not be fearful. How to die if they're in a hospice or a prison, or in my case, in hospitals where, you know, we've had lots of COVID patients who probably won't survive. You know, these are common human, I would say, spiritual experiences. They're not religious. They may not be religious experiences. They're certainly spiritual experience, I would say. That's how I would describe them. Or life experiences, where one hopes that whatever denomination the chaplain is who happens to be on duty would have some concept of ability to support. And of course, as we all know, when you serve in certainly publicly funded chaplaincies, displaying your own, attempting to do anything that persuades somebody is pretty out of bounds. That if they ask to be persuaded, but if you go in as an evangelical of any description, you won't have a job for very long, and rightly so. And if you're
very much.
And if you're judgmental about who's religious enough or not religious enough to have my particular wisdom, you'll say shouldn't last very long. Anyway, I think we want to hear more about yours. I think some people might want to hear, at least I want to hear more about your training program and what's going to happen. I'm going to be quiet now.
All is good. All is good. This is a great conversation. And I love thinking about how we can provide better pastoral care within the community, outside the community. What does that mean? So the volunteer program is still being built and being put together. But the ultimate goal will be, there will most definitely be active listening. There will most definitely be aspects of how to really be present. And then also what to do in noticing your own self in your presence. Because sometimes as a chaplain or a pastoral caregiver, we're sitting in situations that cause feelings within ourselves because we too are human. Whether that is hitting a nerve on something that we've experienced in the past, or something we wholeheartedly disagree with, or just makes us uncomfortable or sad or angry. And how do we sit with all of those feelings while we're sitting in that space so that we're still able to provide active listening and presence and non-judgmental, genuine attention. The course will also cover, how to keep boundaries, which is a little more difficult when you're working in a community than in a hospital. A hospital, you have regulations. You're most likely not going to see everyone when you go to shul the next day or when you're in the grocery store. And they're also potentially the people that you have over for holiday meals or for, tea on a random Tuesday. And so how to keep boundaries and then confidentiality so that what people are sharing doesn't leave you and the volunteer, but also recognizing when what people are saying needs to go up, whether that's to the rabbi or cantor or care coordinator, because that person needs a little bit more help than the volunteer is able to give and provide. And then also signposting and safeguarding. And throughout all the course, hopefully, as it's being planned, there'll also be connections to Jewish texts. Why is this a Jewish, why are these Jewish values? How are they connected to Jewish values? Learning about the laws of Bikar Cholim, of visiting the sick, and Gemilut Chasadim, loving kindness, but also looking even at, safeguarding through a lens of Jewish study. So that is how it's being built, and the cohorts how they're going to be formed is still in conversation, but really hopefully creating a space for volunteers to learn and to train, and then hopefully continue to receive support so that they're not just out there volunteering and holding all the feelings and suffering of their community, but also having a space to talk about that with others who are in a similar situation.
And is it expected that they'll only work within their own congregation, as it were?
It's still being discussed, but it will definitely be that the congregation that they are affiliated with will be the one who's sending them for the training or connecting them to the training. But there's still conversation about how this is going to roll out, especially because I know that there are congregations that don't necessarily have people or enough people to provide the care that they might need at this moment. And so those are things that are being discussed as we speak.
I mean, one of the most fascinating course that you're preparing. Very excited. I mean, I'm sure you'll probably have too many volunteers, but I don't know how you'll manage that. It's not my problem. It's not my issue anymore. It's for others to deal with. But I guess the most, well, you said many interesting things, but the one thing that is, I think, really crucial is knowing our limitations in all sorts of ways, which is not only about when to refer something up because you can't do it, about not making promises that you can't meet, and also just knowing when there's something you can't or don't want to do. You know, we have to be honest. There are some people in our congregations or in our hospitals or wherever who we can't seem to rub along with, to put it crudely. So in an emergency, we might have to see them, but in practice, they're probably relieved if somebody else comes to see them, and we're relieved if somebody else can go. I see that Susan King, I think that's probably from Nottingham, sent the rabbis have space to discuss the feelings get triggered in them by pastoral care. Well, I don't know whether formally, but I think the answer is they should do. Obviously in a hospital, I mean, I've got a managing chaplain, and I've got, had chaplains working for me, so they come to me, and if necessary, I go to the managing chaplain. Our challenge for rabbis is, and I hope that we won't have any solo practitioners in your scheme, Eryn, is that rabbis are often on their own, and they have to think very carefully. I mean, they shouldn't be on their own, about where they can draw their support from. And they do, I mean, rabbis do have mentors through the Leah College now. Rabbis presumably have colleagues, either people they're ordained with. So the simple answer is rabbis should be in a position, as everybody else should be who's providing any sort of care of this nature, have somewhere where they can be supervised informally or discuss what it is that is set, as Susan indicates, has been challenging for them. But it's certainly at the moment probably, I would say, more informal than formal. And the question is, with Eryn coming with her great chaplain's experience from elsewhere, from the United States and elsewhere, where the system is more developed, I suspect the Conference of Liberal Rabbis and Cantors may begin to think about how it might better assist its own members. I'm not saying it's not already doing a good job, and I'm not saying that the rabbis don't have that support. But we all know in professions about burnout, and burnout is partly not about volume of work, but about where they don't have the time or the support, as Susan's indicating, to have that reflective space. So I think
it's
very
difficult.
often that burnout is more about that than it is about the physical amount of work that somebody does. Physical amount of work, if you're overworked, can make you very knackered and very inefficient. But I think real burnout comes when people are not being supported properly in their work.
I would agree with you.
We're not here to talk about rabbinic burnout, by the way, but of course it is an aspect of all types of pastoral care, and of course we may well end up being asked to assist people who are in fact in one form of burnout or another, whether it's professional burnout or just simple life burnout or whatever it is. People not well supported And people who even are well supported can have a collapse of one description or another.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. Also, when you were talking about, you know, the people who we feel like we can't be with, and sometimes that's because also the situation is so overwhelming. I remember a situation I had in the hospital where I was providing support to a family who suffered a horrendous travesty, and I remember going to my supervisor saying that I was having a really hard time not only seeing them, but basically seeing any of my other patients I had to see. Because I was seeing other patients. And my supervisor said something very funny to me, or I found funny, but it was also heartwarming, he's like, I'm happy that you feel overwhelmed right now. Because that situation is so horrendous that if you were not overwhelmed, I'd be really worried about you. I think that's also really important for those who are providing pastoral care in whatever capacity to also notice when they're overwhelmed, and then also find a way, and it's hard to do, to be able to take that step back, whether that is a few moments or it is finding a supervisor or a therapist or trusted person in life to be able to debrief with and to talk to and find that support, so that in order that we can continue to provide care, because if we are burnt out, we're not able to do that.
I remember when I was one of my early chaplaincy posts, we had a rather unusual situation. It was primarily a mental health trust, which was, you know, I was used to going to locked wards and all that, but we were also given, by a historic accident really, a group of what were then called learning disability patients who'd come out of a large hospital and were now in all of these homes. And I remember going to all these homes, and I'm quite a verbal communicator, so most of these people couldn't communicate verbally. And I would sit with them as I was required to do, and sometimes I, you know, play some music or whatever I was required to. And I often thought to myself, do these patients, you know, they were all wheeled in the patient because they didn't have real choice about it really. They were sort of wheeled in and said, oh, the rabbi's come and he's got 6 Jewish patients or whatever it was. And they were sort of wheeled in. And I often thought as I sat next to them, is this person thinking, God, I wish that young man would just shut up and go away. You know, he's disturbed my afternoon tea or whatever I was doing. I've been dragged in here. I don't know what he's doing here, but I don't recognize him and I wish he'd go away. And I remember, and apart from that, most of them didn't communicate. Were not able to communicate, at least as I could understand their communication, let me put it that way. I did go to my supervisor early on and say, what am I doing? You know, I get it if somebody screams at me. I get it if somebody shouts at me. I get it if somebody threatens me. I get it if somebody thanks me or smiles at me or says, I don't want to see you, but good that you're here. Or I don't want to see you. You're a religious nut or whatever. I get that type of response. And when there's no response, how do I know that I'm in the right place? And my supervisor said 2 things. First of all, your presence alone is an indication, if not to the patient, but to the staff, that this is a person who's cared for. I thought it was a very interesting observation. All the staff were not Jewish, of course. And they said it's very likely that if you really cause them real distress, you would know about it. You may not be doing anything very good for them, but you're not harming them or causing them great distress. Because if you were, although you think they can't communicate, they would find a way of indicating to you that your presence was such they didn't want you there. But if people are calm and, you know, make noises that are not what we call normative, in inverted commas, I don't like to use that term, you know what I mean, the chances are then you're probably not doing any harm, and you might be doing some good. And you're certainly doing good as far as the staff are concerned, because they know that people can be looked after by non-Christians, because Christians, of course, there are loads of them around in local churches in this country. And so that was it was a learning curve for me, that was. And I'm still less comfortable. You know, I'm much more comfortable with people who shout and threaten me in a lot, you know. I do the special hospitals where, you know, really serious criminals are. who've done some really serious damage to people. I still feel more comfortable there than I do when people can't communicate with me, even today.
It's hard. One of my what you were saying reminds me of two things. So one of my colleagues in New York worked and still works in a neuro ICU intensive care unit now for years, and so most of her patients are non-communicative.
Wow.
And also most of them can't even indicate necessarily with any other forms. And she's done a lot of research on how to provide pastoral care to non-communicative people. And we had seminars with her, and she would bring us into the neuro unit and show us what she did. And it was walking into the space. It was telling the person that we're there, potentially touching their hand. It depended on the person, and this was pre-COVID times. So, and maybe it was saying a prayer out loud, or just well wishes, or, learning from the family if they were there for a while, which many times, unfortunately, they were, learning from the family what that person loved. And so maybe it was talking about a poem from a poet that they loved, or playing a song from their favorite artist. And so that way there was that form of connection. But I agree with you. It's very hard to be present with someone and kind of have that one-way conversation and not know at all, am I doing anything? Is this something? And what actually makes me think of first is the idea in the Gemara that when one visits the sick, you take away 1/60th of their suffering. And there's a debate, what does that mean? Shouldn't we just send 60 people in and they'll be fine? And it goes on to say, right, we would love for that to be the reality. But it's, it's 1/60th of the whole, and then that 1/60th. But what always drives me in thinking about that is 1/60th in Jewish law is the least amount of something for something to exist. And so it's saying that I don't know what this is doing. I might not be able to put my finger on exactly what it is, but something has happened. And somehow the littlest bit of known possibility of their suffering I've taken with me. And for me, that's a really meaningful thing.
I think that's right. Yeah. But it takes us, those of us who are, passionate givers, it takes some of us some time to reflect on the fact that you can give without receiving. I mean, of course we know we can give without receiving. I mean, where you don't get anything at all, where you just have to be. And that is in itself, active listening is sometimes about just being and being silent, to pick up on the point that Phyllis made before. And I don't think Jews are as good as active of being that some other traditions are, but I think they're too talkative, but maybe that's just me and not everybody else. But it's about what we learn. It's about how we learn. And fortunately, I was appointed chaplain quite young, so now I've had 30, and I'm now the longest serving chaplain in these two areas. But at one time I started like everybody else, knowing very little.
I think
there was no program to train me. I mean, I had some training. Like everybody, like all rabbis, we have a vocational training at the Liberal College, and it trains you for some things, of course. But there are things that often it doesn't train. It doesn't train you. I don't know how you train except to be there, to be in a room with 6 or 8 people who just don't communicate. Just can't. Can't. Well, some of them may choose not to communicate, and that's a different issue, because that's in a way that's but who can't communicate, and who haven't communicated for years. And it's not as if they're dying and you're told that hearing goes last, and therefore you can continue to talk and feel. You're just. I was initially just worried that maybe these people just thought, as I said to you earlier, we want to be somewhere else. We don't really have it. You know, they're very kindly send in the rabbi and find out who's Jewish, and they think they're helping us, giving us a choice, but actually they're not. Because actually I'd rather be sitting in the sun or having a cream cake or whatever it was. And that reflects my own interest, of course. But and suddenly, you know, every once a week, this bloke turns up and chats to us or sings to us or talks to us. You know, and God, would he get but they didn't even have the capacity to say go away. So it was quite challenging initially.
Yeah, it actually reminds me of a very funny story. Before I was training as a chaplain, I worked in nursing care. Right. And ran activities for residents who needed help with all or most of their daily living activities. And some of the residents were more or less non-communicative. And there was one day I was showing a ballet, but it was a modern ballet.
You weren't dancing a ballet?
You weren't
dancing yourself. You were dancing yourself.
I wasn't dancing. I was showing a film.
Oh, okay, yeah.
And one of the men who rarely talks, even when spoken to, but definitely doesn't talk unless spoken to, raised his hand in the middle and said, "Can you please turn this off?" I was so happy that happened because I was like, okay, I mean, it's not the word. I was upset that I was showing something that caused him so much distress, but I was also, it was kind of an amazing thing that he was so distressed that he decided to talk on his own. Not that we should aim to do that to anyone ever. And thankfully it was just a ballet rather than something much more severe. But also I was thinking about while you were talking is the difficulty of, you know, for many of us, we get into this because we want to help and we want to change, we want to do. And I think one of the biggest difficulties is how do we sit with someone when we can't fix their problem, when they're not going to get better, when the only thing that we have is to sit in that place with them, and that's it.
See, I don't mind that. I don't mind if people want you to be realistic about the prospects and say there are no prospects. It's the non-communication that I find the most difficult. I have found the most difficult historically. With people who are quite young and well dressed and look like you and me, except they haven't communicated with anybody for 20 years or
it's hard,
but you're right to say.
I'm just thinking more globally.
No. Listen, you're absolutely right to say. One of the challenges is not when you hand something over when you can't cope with something, but when actually, even if you had the best chaplain in the world, they can't reverse a cancer necessarily. They can't bring back a child. They can't do many of the things that people would like them to do, you know, that we'd all like to be done in different different circumstances.
I think about AAC.
I have to say that's relatively new to me, so I will need to find out more about that from Sabrina. Thank you very much indeed for putting that. As I say, whenever I offer to do a session, I always learn something and take something away. Other than, of course, being with Eryn, which is great, who's relatively new. I think you're new to this country as well. I'm certainly new to Liberal Judaism. So, right. So we've got a lot to learn from Eryn, who's a high, experience in a manner in which most of British rabbis are not experienced. In other words, the chaplaincy training in the States is considered to be the greatest, really. Although I am pleased to say that I've had a Leah College student on placement with me who's now been accepted onto the bank staff. So we are beginning, but I know that, and we are going to have to close soon, Eryn, so because I can see it's already, to say that I'm delighted that you're here. I'm delighted to hear and learn about your work, and I'm looking forward to, unfortunately it's not for rabbis, it's for lay people, but to hearing more about what you're going to be doing for our congregants and congregations.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to actually get to meet you and talk to you, and feel welcomed into this community. as I am relatively new. And I'm excited for this. It is something that's, for me, fun and exciting. And I think that it's going to be a really wonderful training program. And who knows what's going to happen in the future of who it will encompass.
Sure.
And hopefully it'll help break down the walls to offer support to those who are calling out and even those who are not calling out.
Well, your very presence, of course, has broken down walls because you're different you're not trained at the Leah College, and where most of our rabbis are trained. I mean, some of them are HUC trained. So your very presence itself, and the fact you've broken down, you're working on a joint reform and liberal project, means you are an exemplar of the challenge, the good opportunity rather than challenge, that breaking down walls brings. Kabbalat Shabbat, I believe, is due to start very soon.
Yes,
I don't know whether we're going to be cut off any minute now, which we probably should be, because I think Kabbalat Shabbat is at 6 o'clock. Am I right about that? I'm asking somebody to, yes,
Yep.
So it's on at 6 o'clock. It's on Zoom. I'm hearing from Rabbi Charlie Baginski, our Chief Executive Officer at Liberal Judaism, saying that Kabbalat Shabbat is on in about 5 minutes on Zoom. I can't tell you any more than that unless Charlie wants me to say more, in which case she needs to put something in the chat. But that's a nice message. Hi, Danny, but it doesn't tell me any more than I can tell the punters. We probably are we supposed to conclude at 5:02? Is that right? If there's any last points to be made by those of you who are watching and listening, you can do so now. Says it should be right. If you're registered, you will have got a Zoom link for Kabbalat Shabbat. If not, it's streamed on Facebook and YouTube. I think I'm doing very well here, Charlie, for a Luddite. So that's all I can tell you. And on the Liberal Judaism website, the information's coming in now. It's dripping in through the private chat feed. So Kabbalat Shabbat in about 5 minutes on our website. That's the Liberal Judaism website, streamed on Facebook and YouTube. If you registered, you'll be sent the Zoom links. It's probably time for us to say Shabbat Shalom. We hope you've enjoyed this session. If you want to know anything more about chaplaincy, your main professional, of course, is Rabbi Eryn London, who's the Reform and Liberal Judaism coordinator for this new project. I'm always happy to take inquiries if you wish. We're going to leave you now and say goodbye. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.